Hi there folks, in today's demonstration I'm going to show you how I built a solution using Microsoft Forms and also Power Automate to complete dynamic documents. So here I am going and selecting different sections of the document that I either want to appear or not appear, and based on that I have branching that allows me to type in various variables and make optional choices. So here you can see me completing the form for my child pocket money agreement. So if I submit that, what's happening behind the scenes now is that Power Automate is going away and grabbing those sections based on the choices that I made, the yeses and the nos, and then populating a Word document with that data. We can see on screen I have my Word document, my template, and I either populate that data as a single text string or using repeating controls. And then ultimately, if we pop across onto my document library here and open up the Word document, we can see the choices I've made. They'll get £50 of pocket money per fortnight, which now I think about it is far too much. They must save 25% and their tasks must be tidying the bedroom, mowing the lawn and cleaning the bathroom. And similarly, if we go down to the bottom, we have exactly the same content, but in this repeating content control. So if that's something that interests you, please make sure you watch on. It's something that I can potentially demonstrate using a Power App at a later date. If there's interest, just let me know in the comments. But without further ado, let's jump into the demonstration. So here I am in a Microsoft form, and this Microsoft form is going to allow me to set up a dynamic document based on the answers to the following questions. So my template form could potentially have a section on purpose, amount. If I choose amount, then I can define the amount. So we've got some conditional branching as well that will appear in the document or not, depending on the selections made. We've got pay period, earnings, spending, savings, percentage again, which is another variable which will pass into the text that's supplied for the savings section. And then some more questions, including a multiple choice, because I thought it'd be quite useful as well, just to see how we can bring some multiple choice answers into our dynamic document. Across on my document library, I have a template document, but I also have a list. And that list has those sections. So if you remember, as we're going through that Microsoft form, we spoke about purpose, amount, earnings, etc. These are our sections and they're dynamic. Again, the content here we can update. And as we make changes to this, the next time the flow runs, it will pick up the most current text that's in these sections. Now, also, you might see in some of these content columns, I have what looks like some pipes, some double pipes here for amount. And again, I've got some double pipes here for percentage to save. So these are markers, placeholders for the variables or the data that's passed through in the Microsoft form. So if we use this naming convention here, like amount, like pay space period, like percentage to save, then we can pass across and populate that data into this string. So not only are the sections within the document dynamic, but also the content within those sections are dynamic too. So here's the flow. I am going to build this from scratch, but I just thought I'd quickly highlight what the flow will potentially look like. You'll note as we work through this flow, there are no conditional blocks. There's no branching. There's no apply to each loops. So this is a very, very efficient flow with only the necessary actions required in order to complete this. Next, if we fire up the Word template that's used for this dynamic document, you'll see that I have some placeholders. I have a content part here called dynamic text from form, and that is a single text input for the data that we're capturing. And my idea here is to demonstrate two methods of achieving this within the Word document. One is to do all the formatting within Power Automate, so all the sections will be formatted as a single text string. And the second one is here using a repeating control. So we can see we have here one of the controls called repeating. If I go to properties, there it is. But within that repeating control, I have two more controls, one for the title of the section and one for the content of the section. And of course, if we pass an array to this repeating control, we can populate that data dynamically. So I do have a video on repeating controls, so I'm not going to go into much more detail than that. In the middle of my document, you can see I just have some further details, some more sections that are fixed, so they don't change depending on the decisions made within that Microsoft form, and I just purely wanted to include both some fixed text and some dynamic text just to highlight how we can update these with a Power Automate flow. One more thing to mention before I leave this Word document: if I go ahead and again select this text control and go into properties, you'll notice that there is an option at the bottom here to allow carriage returns for multiple paragraphs. So if you're passing any strings that include a return line in them and you're finding that those lines are coming through as a continuous line, you need to go and have a look at that control and tick this little box. And I've done that on both the single text control here, but also the repeating text control for content as well. You can see I've ticked that box. I've not done that, for instance, on my title, because my title is just going to be a single line. So let's now start building the solution and understand why and how it comes together. So you'll see that I've got the beginnings of a flow here. When a new response is submitted, of course, that will trigger my flow based on the form called Child Pocket Money Agreement. And then I'll use the get response details action in order to get all of those responses. And at this point, I'm actually going to put the flow into test mode because I'd like to look back at the history of data that comes through in the flow when it's triggered. So we'll go on to the Microsoft form. I'll now complete the various sections here. I'll say yes to the purpose, no to the amount, and we'll include the earnings and the spending and the savings. I have a branching logic here, so if I selected savings, I can put in the percentage, so we'll go with 25% that they must save, and regular tasks, we'll say yes here, and we'll choose tidy bedroom and vacuum the carpets, and we'll submit that. Jumping back onto our flow now, we can look at the response details, and whilst it looks lovely and neat and tidy here and understandable within this output, we do have an example of an array, which is how the task from the multiple choice comes through. But if we have a look at the show raw outputs, this is where things get interesting and you start to realize the limits of Microsoft Forms and the data that's returned. So you'll see that every single form answer comes with one of these lovely strings here, which means very little to you and I, and you'll probably end up trying to create some form of conditional logic and get into quite a mess. So what we're actually going to do now is we're going to repurpose what's called an object, this everything between these squiggly brackets, and you turn it into something that's going to be useful for our solution. But the thing to note is we have some yeses and some nos, and these are our different sections, and we'll be able to filter on whether or not someone has returned a yes, in which case we'll include that section, or a no, in which case we obviously won't. And then some of these other values, like 25, which we know is a percentage, we're going to turn into another variable or a key within an object, and we'll be able to use that dynamically within the strings that we create in our SharePoint list. Now, I've got lots more videos on my YouTube that explain how to build expressions, how to use objects dynamically. So there's plenty of learning on my channel if none of this is making sense. But I am going to walk you through this step by step because I realize it is quite a complex solution. So jumping back into my flow, the first thing I want to do is to repurpose all that data because at the moment it's not really going to be very useful. So I like to use a compose. You could initialize a variable and set it up as an array, but ultimately what I want to do here is to create an array. And an array consists of an opening and a closing square bracket and then an object in squiggly brackets like so. Now, every single object is then separated by a comma, and then you can repeat the same thing again, and just think of it like a row in an Excel table. Now for this, what I wanted to do is I want to define a table with two columns. The first column is going to be the section name, and of course I've got those 6 sections on my form that are all optional, and then I want to give the section name a name. So in this case, I'm going to call the first one purpose, because I know that if I look at my form here, we go back, the first section is called purpose, the second one is called amount, and so on. The next column within this object is going to be included. Okay, so are we going to include this section? Yes or no? And this is when we now jump across onto the right hand side and look at our dynamic content. So one of these, if I type in purpose, is called purpose section, and the answer to that question is going to be a yes or no. And what we've now constructed is an object, or in effect 2 columns in a table, with the section name purpose and then either dynamically a yes or a no, and we'll be able to filter on that data later on as a result of constructing these objects. So I can now go ahead and copy everything between these squiggly brackets, including the squiggly brackets, and then if I put a comma to separate that object from the next one, I can paste in this one. And the next section, of course, is amount. So I can go ahead now and put in the name amount. I can get rid of this dynamic value for the purpose section, and I can search for the amount section. And I'm going to do this now for the remaining 4 sections that I've got, and I'll come back to you shortly with the completed array. Okay, so here I am back with my completed array. You can see I have the 6 different sections that are optional within my document. I've given them all a section name, so a purpose, amount, earnings, spending, savings, and regular. And then I've matched up the yes/no dynamic answer to the field included. And I'll run that shortly once we've created one more compose. So I'm going to close that down or minimize it, and I'm going to add another compose. And this compose, I'm actually just going to give it a name of variable data, because this is where we're going to now repurpose the data from the response details to use as dynamic data within these strings. So amount, pay period, percentage to save. I'm sure there's a couple of extras, regular tasks. So these are placeholders, and it's incredibly important that when we create these placeholders, they match the setup that we're going to create now in our Power Automate flow. So regular task has no space, for instance, but deliberately I've put pay period with a space. So it's incredibly important that whatever field names you decide upon, you keep them consistent between both the string and the setup within your flow. So back onto our flow, we have this compose object waiting for us, and this time we're going to create an object. So an object has the opening and closing squiggly brackets, and this is where we want to redefine anyway the variables from our form response, and one of those is amount. So I asked the question, what is the amount, if you've chosen the amount section, and I want to be able to use that value dynamically based on a name rather than that horrible string that we saw in the get response details. So I can type in the word amount in inverted commas like we see here, and then I can select the define amount piece. And I can now query that data based on the compose variable data amount value. And so I'm going to do the same now for pay period, and you'll see I'm actually including a space in this one, and that's because, like I mentioned, pay period here has a space, and if we were to look at our list, I have a space in my placeholder here. Case is not important as far as I'm aware, but definitely it needs to be an identical string if you want this to work. And of course the pay period, if I go and do a quick search here for period, we have define the pay period, and I have 2 more variable items, the percentage to save, which has got no spaces. Again, I need to make sure that's in inverted commas, put in the semicolon here, and we'll choose the percentage to save. And then you'll note that after each one, I'm putting a comma in place. So if you miss your commas, you'll get an error. The final one is regular tasks. So at the end of my form, I'm able to make a selection of the regular tasks that my child has to complete. But really, it was just to demonstrate the use case for multiple choice. And what we need to do here is we need to join that output of that array to form a string, because at the moment it's an array. So we can do that using a series of expressions. So the first one that we need to use here is JSON. So at the moment, whilst to you and I in that history it looked like an array in square brackets, we need to use a JSON expression in order to remove or to parse that data as a JSON array. Now the value I'm looking for here is the tasks that must always be completed. So there we go. And that will return to me a nice JSON array. Now of course at this point, it's not really useful. What I'd like to do now is to join the values within that array. And if I go all the way to the end of my expression and put in a comma, you can see that it wants to know what to join these values on. And I want to join these on if I put a single quotes here, a comma and a space. So every value within that array will then be separated with a comma and a space, and that will create us a nice comma separated list of regular tasks or any multiple choice. If you'd rather have a return line separated list, you can insert a return line in here, and of course that would give you each of those tasks on separate lines. So go ahead and hit OK. I'm now going to test this and just demonstrate what we've done with the details that have come back from the form. I'll go into the automatic and choose the previous test run that we did, and hopefully some of this now will start to make a bit more sense. But even if you're not using this for your own scenario, it's a great way of demonstrating how you can repurpose that Microsoft form data and use it in a more meaningful way. So into our compose, we can now see that we have this repeatable structure here with the section name and if it's included, yes or no. And we're going to use that now to perform a filter. So any section that has a string yes, we will keep. And obviously any with a no will drop because these are optional sections. Then if we look at this variable data, you can see now we have all of the variable data, including amount, pay period, which we didn't set in the last form because these were optional values, but we have got the percentages to save and we have got the regular tasks in the form of a string because of course we joined that value with a comma and a space. So now we're on to the interesting bit. We are going to start filtering this top array and then getting the data from our list based on those that have been selected on the Microsoft form. So the next part of our solution is to filter the data that's in our compose. We saw in the history that we have that included tag or included column, and we want to filter on that. So we'll go and select the compose as the from. If we remind ourselves about the compose here, we have this included key. If I jump back into the filter, I'm going to have to type in an expression now. So the expression is going to be based on item, open close brackets, question mark, square brackets, and then we will put in single quotes the word included. And so that's going to check to see if that key included is equal to, now this is case sensitive, I've used uppercase within my answers on my form, equal to yes. And that's going to filter back only those sections that have been selected as yes. Then the next thing I'd like to do is to repurpose some of this data, and it will make sense shortly, but I'm going to use a select action. And the great thing about select is it allows you to repurpose that data. Again, we're going to take the data from the filter array, and with that we're going to change this mapping into a text mode. So traditionally you give a key and a value, but if we put into a text we will just get an array of values. And the reason I do this is now I want to do is just retrieve the section names, and this is going to allow us to perform a filter afterwards to see which sections we need to include from our SharePoint list. So the expression here is the item, open close brackets, square brackets and single quotes, and we want to retrieve the section name, and that is all based on the original compose. We have section name, but of course we're retrieving this data from the filter. So our filter has only those sections that are equal to yes, and then our select will only bring back the section names as a new array. Next step is to get the items. So we have that SharePoint list. It has all those sections in it. And so I just want to connect to my dynamic doc site, connect to the list with those sections. And then as a little trick, I'm just going to put a / in here to limit entries to folder, which is the root. And that will prevent me getting any warning messages at the top here. The next section, or the next piece that I'd like to do, and I will jump into the history once we've set up the last two pieces here, is another select. And this select is going to allow us to repurpose the data that's come back from the get items. Because if you've ever looked at the data that comes back in get items, it's quite messy. There's a whole host of columns that come back. And so we're going to use this select to repurpose it just so we get back the title and the content. So I'm going to rename this as select from SharePoint list. The from is going to be based on the value from the get items, and this time we are going to keep the keys and the values. So our key is going to be title and also content, and then with the values we can go ahead and select the dynamic values for title, and of course I can do a search for content. And so these match the section title, which is actually the title field, and the content field. And that's all I want to bring back in my array in Power Automate. So the final piece before we move on to the fancy bit in Word is to do one last filter. So we'll go into new step, we'll search for the filter array action. And then what we're looking to do now is we want to filter the select, which is of course all the items from our SharePoint list, based on the ones that we've selected, which are in this select above. And in order to do that, the from is going to be based on this select from SharePoint list. Here we go, select from SharePoint list. The first thing to compare against is the select at the top here. So if we just scroll through our dynamic content and have a look for the select output, there we go. And of course, this is an array of all the sections that are equal to yes. So at the moment, the from is based on all the sections. For instance, we could have 10 sections. This next value here is a list of only those sections we want to keep based on the filter, the first filter that we created. So if we've picked 3 sections, then we're currently have an array of 3 sections. Then instead of using is equal to, we're going to use contains. So basically, does this array, which is the 3 or however many sections have been selected in our form, contain the title? And so with the expression tab here, if I type in item, open close brackets, square brackets and single quotes, I can type in the word title. And so what this will now do is it'll have a look at this array, which is all of the items from our list. It'll have a look at this array, which is only the section names for those sections that have been selected. And it will check to see if the title, which is the title here from our get items, is contained within that select. And that's what will enable us then to get down to our selected sections based on the Microsoft form choices. So of course we'll put it into test now. I'm going to run it back on one of my previous attempts of data, and that's the flow now run. And the thing we want to explore is, we know from looking at before, we have all these yeses and nos, so amount is definitely a no. If we have a look at that first filter array, we can see if we look through the input, we have amount, but if we look through the output, because we filtered where that only equals to yes, we do not have that section included. And we can see within this select here, we've taken that original array to just return an array of those section names. Get items is straightforward. It gets all those items. And if I was to pop open the JSON data, you can see here there's a whole host of stuff which we don't need. Hence, if we have a look at this select, we've taken this horrible input here of all this data in JSON and turned it into a new array with just the title and the content. And if we have a look at some of these content examples, you can still see we have these placeholders. Then finally, our filter array look has taken all of those sections that are available on the get list, and it has then turned it into just an array of those that we require. So we can see that that section amount is here in the input because it's based on all of the items from the SharePoint list. But if we have a look now after purpose here on the output, we do not have the amount section because we've now excluded it using that filter where it must be contained. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense. The next bit is to jump into the exciting Word part. So the first thing I'm going to do is back into edit, jump down to the bottom of my flow, and I am going to create two compose actions. The first compose action is going to be a single return line, like so, and I'm just going to rename that to return line. So we'll just rename it as return line, and I'm simply going to put my cursor in there and hit the return. Then the next one, I'm going to add another compose, and I am going to call this return line times 2. So return line times 2, and again, one return, two returns. And you'll be wondering, what on earth are you doing here? Well, this is required as part of the formatting of the data for our Word document. So with those two now set up, I need to now repurpose again the data that's come back from the filter array. So now we'll go ahead and insert another select, and the purpose of this is to repurpose the data from the filter. So we're down to however many sections have been chosen, and we're going to use this filter array 2, which I'm actually going to go ahead and rename. So filter array selected sections. And that'll allow me then to make a more defined choice here. So filter array selected sections. And instead of using the map with a key and the value, I'm going to put it into text mode, and I'm going to use an expression known as concat. Because if we think about that filter array, it's all based on the select here, which is going to include a title and then the content. But I want to turn this into a string because I want to pass this into a Word document. So there are two ways of doing this, remember. The first is to have all that data on a repeating or on a single text control here called dynamic text from form, and we'll have to format all that data within Power Automate before passing it as a single parameter. The other option is to do a repeating control. Now, a repeating control actually needs an array and an object, and it needs to be in the same shape as this repeating control. So one called title and one called content. So if I jump back onto my flow, I've got my select here. I'm taking the data from this filter array, which is the one above here. And then in my map, I want to go into the expression tab and I want to use concat. And with that concat, we are going to select the item title. So item, open close brackets, question mark, square brackets and single quotes. And that is going to be equal to the title. Then after that square bracket, a comma, the next thing we want to put in is a single return line. So I'd like the section header name at the top and then the section or the content after on a separate line. So that's why I created these two compose actions, one with a single, one with a double return. If I go into my dynamic content, I can select the single return line, and now we have a concatenation that includes the title followed by a return line. With our final comma, I can then go ahead and type in another expression, which is going to be based on the item, open close brackets, question mark, square brackets, single quotes, and then the content. Now if I hit OK, that's going to give us now an array of each of the sections, but in a nicely formatted way. We'll have the title followed by a return line followed by the content. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename this here to the formatted data. So now that we've got all this data repurposed within an array, we now want to create a single text string, and we can use that using a join. And this is why I have a compose with a double return line. So I'm going to insert another compose, and I'm going to give that a name, the compose join sections. And then I'm going to use the expression join. And with that, I am going to join each of the values within our select above based on a return line. So I'll go into dynamic content. We'll have a look for this select here, selected formatted data. And then I'm going to put in a comma. And what would I like to join it on? I'd like to join it on two return lines. So that will return after the line and then create a second return so that we've got a space between each of these sections and titles. Hit OK, and I think I'll stop here and we'll go ahead and test and look at the output. So we'll put it into test mode. And now that the flow is completed, if we jump down to the bottom, we can see the selected formatted data. We've started with the title and then the content. We've turned it into individual strings here, and you can see the return line and then the content. And then if we go into the joined sections, you can see now we've turned it into a single string where each of the titles are on one line, the contents on another, and then we've created two return lines between each of these strings above, so that we have a nicely formatted text string. Now, as things stand, if we didn't have any variables within our text, we could of course pass that straight into our Word template. But I have obviously made things a bit more complicated to include these variables just in case you have that situation yourself. If you don't, you can jump on to further on in the video. If you do, let's watch the next bit. So back into edit, we're now going to split on those pipes. And so I'm going to use another select because I don't know the name of these variables within our strings other than that initial compose that I created at the beginning. And we can use some clever tricks here using JSON expressions and arrays. So into my select, I am going to give this a new name. We're going to call this split on delimiter. And we're going to use the expression split. So if I go into the expression tab here, type in split, open close brackets, and we're going to split the joined sections. So that's one long text string, and we're going to split on our pipes. And so what that's going to do is it's going to give us an array of text values based on the split using those pipes. And what I can do now is I can replace the values that match the variable data. So anywhere where the word and only the word in each of the sections equals amount or pay period or percentages to save or regular tasks, they'll be replaced with these values that we pulled across in this object. If these words appear in a full text string, then they will not be replaced. And just to demonstrate that, if I go into text mode here, this is not required for the solution, but I think I'll do it and then go back into edit. If I put in the expression item, which is just going to return each of those items in an array based on this split, if we test it and run it, we can have a quick look at that select before running it again on the expression that we'll actually require. So right down to the bottom, we can see the effect of the split on the delimiter. We can see that anywhere where these text with these words have appeared, like percentage to save and regular tasks, they are on separate lines or within separate values in our array, and because they match identically to the values in our variable data, we can then pluck these values out and populate them into our string. Now you're probably wondering, why doesn't amount and pay period exist? Well, of course, amount and pay period doesn't exist because we haven't chosen those sections. And if we were to choose those sections, then of course they would appear in this array. It's completely dynamic. So jumping back onto edit, if I go to the bottom of our flow, if I delete this item that I've inserted here, and what we're going to do now is we're going to use something known as coalesce. And what coalesce is going to do is it's going to allow us to either return the value from our compose above or just stick with the original string. So into the expression coalesce, it returns the first non-null value. We're going to base it on the output from this compose at the top, so compose variable data. And then in the question mark and square brackets, what we're going to be putting in here is item open close brackets. And so what it's going to do now is it is going to try and query the data from this object based on this value. So amount, pay period, percentage save, regular tasks. If it doesn't find it, what's the fallback? And that's the benefit of coalesce. If there's nothing returned by this expression, all we want to do is return the original string, which is item open close brackets. Now if I say OK to that, because I've split these all up and I've created an array, I now need to join them all back together on a null string. So with a compose, we'll go into compose here, I can now join everything that's been split on this delimiter, and we'll end up back to where we started off, but with our dynamic data. So we'll do a join on that selected split on delimiter with a comma and single quotes that you can see here. So there's nothing between those single quotes. It'll just join on nothing. Hit OK. And if we just rename this again to joined string with dynamic data, that in effect has given us everything that we need for our dynamic data. So I'll go ahead and hit save and test. And if we have a look at the bottom of our flow here, we can see now that we have hopefully the dynamic content within our string. So the child will be encouraged to save 25%, and the child must ensure that they complete the following regular tasks: tidy bedroom and vacuum the carpets. If we had a look at the sections above, we'd be able to see that we have the placeholders for percentage to save and regular tasks. And of course, this select, because we've done this split on the pipes and we have percentage to save and regular tasks, it's then be able to pluck these values, 25 and tidy room and vacuum the carpets, from our compose variable data at the top here based on these key values. So that really allows us now to pass this whole string onto our Word template. And if we have a look at our original Word template, we've got this basic placeholder here for a complete string of all the data. But I also said I would create it using the repeating section control. So with the repeating section control, you need to pass an array, and that array needs to be in the form of title and content. And so going back to our history here, we can see at the moment I have this in the form of a string. So we actually need to repurpose this string back into an array so that we can then pass it across to the Word template using option 2. So how is that done? Well, it's just one more select. And we're going to split on a double return line, which of course will then give us an array of these two lines. And then we're going to split again to get our title and our content. So if I go into edit all the way to the bottom, choose another one of my favorite actions, good old select. And then the input here is going to be based on a split on the return lines. So we'll go into expression, split. We're going to split this joined string with dynamic data. And if I put a comma here, I then want to split on a return line times 2 and hit OK. And then when it comes to the map, we said that we need to have title and we need to have content. And with the title, again, we want to split, this time on a return line. So I'll go here, split. We want to split the item with the open close brackets, and I'll put in a comma, and we're going to split on a single return line this time. And with it split on a single return line, we're going to have an array with two values. So the title and the section data. So I want to select the first. I can use the value 0 there. We can either use 0 or first. I'm going to copy that expression, go into value, paste it in, and then for the content, I want to pick the number 1, which of course will give us our second string from that array. So having given this expression some consideration, I realized that content could potentially contain multiple return lines. And in my case, if you choose the section that has the multiple choice, I do have a return line in there. So if we use this expression here with the question mark and 1, it means we're only going to return the first line from that string if it contains the return lines. So there is a way around this. If we delete that question mark 1 and go to the beginning of our expression, which is our split based on the return line, what we actually want to do is we want to skip the first object, which is going to be our title. So you can put in skip, go to the end of that and put in a 1. That means we'll skip the title. And then we can actually join all of this data back up again using a return line. So a join at the beginning, and if we go to dynamic content, we can go and hunt down that return line, put in a close bracket and hit update. And that updated expression will actually deal with strings that contain multiple return lines. So that is just us repurposing the data for Word option 2. And we can now go ahead and populate our Word template and create our file. So these are the last two steps of our solution now. We'll go ahead and populate our Word template. And I will, of course, upload these things so that you can have a look at my finished flow, but also try it out for yourself. So the group is my dynamic documents, if I can find that. The document library is just going to be my default document library. The file is based on my template, which we have here, template with dynamic content. And then that will pop up the parameters that's either looking for the single text string, which is based on this composed join string with dynamic data. So we can pass that in here. Or the second option is the repeating controls. And I can just show you what the output of that repeating control looks like. So if I put in the word title and content and then turn on this entire array, we can see the format here is an array with square brackets and then an object with title and content. We have created that using the select. It's going to be an array with title and content. So all we need to do is delete that sample text, make sure we're in the correct mode, and then we can supply that select word option 2. Of course, now that that template is populated, we need to create a file using that content. So we'll go to create a file. Again, select our site address like we normally do, our folder path, which is just going to be my default document library in this case. File name, it needs to be unique. So I can use GUID for this demo, but you could use format, date, time, etc. Don't forget that file extension for docx. And then we have our file content, which is based on the populator Word document. And that is it. We're now going to populate a document dynamically with sections that contain variable data, all from a Microsoft form. Hit save, we can go into test, we can run it on that previous version here, hit the test button, jump across onto our document library, and we should, with a little refresh, have a new document here. And if I open that up, we'll be able to see those sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can see the 25%. We can see that they need to tidy the bedroom and vacuum the carpets. And if we scroll down to the bottom here, based on those repeating values, we've also got exactly the same. And if we have a quick look at the history, scroll down to the bottom here, we can see that we have this string data that we've passed as our first option, or we have this select, which has turned all that data by splitting it based on the double returns and then using the integer indexes to create an array using that title and content, which is exactly the format that our Word template is looking for a repeating control. So, a pretty complex video, this one. I hope I've covered it in enough detail to allow you to attempt it yourself. I will upload this flow, but also the Word template so that you can have a head start. And if you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe, share away, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thanks for watching.